Okay, chapter 12 here. Same disclaimer that you've seen. You can read it. You know the drill by now. This chapter, this lesson, I should say, is all about media theory and research. You'll get a chance to learn about some of the theories that have been developed in mass communication over the years, and also how you learn a little bit about the scientific method at the start. It kind of gives you some idea of what kind of thought process goes into any kind of research, really, any kind of scientific research, but also mass communication research. So let's do that at the start. Let's take kind of this step back and think about what science is and what the scientific method is. It's very different from other ways of knowing things. The scientific method is a set of procedures for the systematic and objective observation, collection, processing, analysis, and reporting of information. So it's very different from, well, I asked a guy and he told me, or, well, that's what my uncle says, or I think that's the case because I think I saw some things a few times. I think it seems like movies are getting more violent now. Well, scientists, that's not how scientists operate, and that's not how the scientific method works. The scientific method is systematic. We have to systematically observe things and then measure them. Okay, we can't just, well, it feels like movies are becoming more violent, right? We can't make claims like that. We have to test those kinds of claims because those are empirical claims, meaning they are claims that need to be observed and measured. Okay, so that's what the scientific method is all about. And many times we're interested in causality, whether or not one thing causes another thing. In science, that's oftentimes what we're interested in. So if you'll notice in our daily lives, we talk about causality very casually, don't we? We say, well, this causes that, and that causes this, and the reason my favorite team stinks is because of the coach, or it's because of the quarterback, or it's because of whatever. We don't really know. I mean, we're very casual. We talk about causality very casually, and scientists don't like that. Scientists are very cautious when they talk about causality because it has to be observed and measured, right? We have to know that A causes B. If you're going to say movies make people more violent, you better have observed and measured. You better have done a study, right? And there are 3 criteria for causality. All 3 of these have to be met in order for you to say A causes B. There has to be a logical relationship between the 2 variables, between A and B. Time order, that's kind of a given, right? It's kind of obvious. The cause has to come before the effect, right? And then the third one is probably the most difficult one, and that is you have to be able to eliminate confounding variable explanations. You have to be able to eliminate all other possible explanations, right? So let me see if I can think of an example here off the top of my head. So you'll have, okay. So you'll have a lot of people. I'm thinking of this because I'm just working on a paper right now that's kind of broadly that's sort of broadly or in this broad area. And that is this whole notion of terrorism and its link to religion, and specifically the religion of Islam, right? You hear it all the time, Islamic terrorism and so on and so forth. So one explanation that's been thrown out, right, a causal explanation, is that Islam makes people violent, which is why you have, terrorist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and so on and so forth. So that's one explanation. But really from a social scientific perspective, that is a deeply problematic claim because we have all kinds of issues. What if those societies were violent before Islam even came there? What if something else is causing people to become violent? What if it's social conditions like the lack of democracy, like tyranny, like mass repression, like poverty, and so on and so forth, lack of education? There are lots of confounding variables here. And in fact, I happen to be familiar with this particular area of research. If you read the works that have been written by people like Stephen Brooke and Shadi Hamid, Stephen Fish, Meredith Wheeler, and others, really, it's a gross oversimplification. It's actually outright incorrect to say that Islam causes violence. Otherwise, if that were the case, then pretty much any devout Muslim, or the majority at least, should be violent, should be prone to violent terrorism. But that's not what we have, right? So there has to be some other explanation. And so you had these quantitative empirical analyses, like the one that was done relatively recently by Stephen Brooke and Shadi Hamid, where they found that there's a direct kind of causal correlation between the amount of tyranny, the degree, not just tyranny, but the degree of tyranny, and then these kinds of groups, these terrorist groups, thrive, and they pop up, right? So anyways, that's just an example. It's deeply problematic. A similar example that's been there's been a debate. I was just reading something on the internet today. So some people who are in my estimation, you might disagree, but in my estimation, they may have some, racist tendencies, and they make the claim that, they'll say, well, look at the crime statistics, right? The crime statistics in the United States. African Americans commit a disproportionate number of the crimes, or at least they're caught, right? A disproportionate amount of the time. They make up a disproportionate amount of or percentage of the prison population, and so on and so forth. And so some people who are racist will say, well, it's because they're black. I actually was just reading this. It's because they're African American. They're just inherently inferior, right? This is actually something that I was reading. It's a series. I mean, people take these kinds of arguments very seriously, right? But it's an utterly preposterous argument, not only from a moral standpoint. Forget about the morality for a minute. Okay, leave that aside. But just from a social scientific standpoint, right? There are myriad causes of violence. We know exactly why violence and crime are committed from sociological perspectives, right? If you put a bunch of people, if you cram a bunch of people into an area that's, poverty infested, right? Then and you create unequal social conditions, and then a number of other factors, lack of education and so on and so forth. I mean, the inner city, the phenomenon of the inner city, not just in the United States, by the way, in many societies, right? You can go to the ghettos of Eastern Europe. You can go to the ghettos of, ghettos in Egypt, where I spent 2.5 years from 2011 to 2014. Crime increases in these areas. So there are other explanations, right? There are other explanations. I mean, the whole phenomenon of the inner city in this country, I mean, it's not the case in other countries necessarily, but in this country, the inner city phenomenon, as we know it, is a product of slavery, or more specifically, the sort of the 100-year period after slavery of the repressive area of unequal laws and segregation and Jim Crow and so on and so forth. That actually produced the inner city, which is why when you go to the inner city, almost everyone is, most of the people are, people of color, right? So it's very much a racial issue. So it's forget about the morality, but from a social scientific perspective, it's really problematic to say, oh, black people are just more prone to committing crimes, right? We have to be very careful, not just about terrorism or crime, but if you pay attention, during the course of a day, I kid you not, just pay attention tomorrow, you will hear at least 15 or 20 causal claims. Probably some on the TV, some in your household. Your friends will say things about very serious issues, and then also about very, trivial matters. Happens all the time with politics, right? Well, the economy's bad. Well, it's because of President Obama. Well, the economy's good. There are some good indicators right now. Well, it's because of President Obama, right? I mean, the point is not that every single causal claim is wrong, but you have to investigate causal claims. You should take anything that people say with a grain of salt. And that includes, by the way, some of the scientific studies that are published. are flawed. I mean, the scientific method is great. But it's not flawless, right? It's possible that things can fall through the cracks, can slip through the cracks. So, anyways, very important to understand these three criteria for causality. An experiment is a method that we use to test for causality. This is where we manipulate the independent variable. That's the variable that we think might be causing a change in the other variable, which we call the dependent variable. And experiments are really the only true method, the only tried and true method that you can use to measure causality, right? And there are other ways to do it, but that's kind of the best way, because in an experiment, everything is controlled. A hypothesis, these are some terms that you just need to know. A hypothesis, you can think of it as an educated guess. It's a testable prediction about what will happen. Sometimes we do the study and our hypothesis is supported. Sometimes we do the study and our hypothesis is not supported. Okay? I'm looking at my watch, sorry, because I'm actually going to leave the house. This is going to be a short part 1. And then I'll do probably part 2 and then probably part 3 for this lesson because it's a long lesson. But this will be short because I actually have to leave in a few minutes here. But continuing on with some of our definitions, what is a theory? You hear about theories all the time, right? You read, you listen to lectures and people are talking about theories, but have you ever thought about what a theory actually is, the proper definition? You can think of a theory as a statement of relationships between variables. It's an explanation of some event or phenomenon or state of affairs. And importantly, the theory comes out of a great deal of study, a great deal of systematic observation, okay? They don't just come, you can't just, in our daily lives, we talk about this very casually. We say, well, I have a theory about something. That's fine, but that's not a theory, right? That's not a scientific theory is based on usually hundreds of studies that have been done before we can say, okay, now we have a theory for how something works. Okay, so again, be very cautious. But theories are very important. When I sit down to do a study, in almost all mass comm studies, you'll see this. If you look at the journals, the academic journals in our field, they're guided by theories. We sit down with a theory, and the theory actually helps us to set up our study. It guides our research. In many cases, our hypotheses come from the theories. And you'll kind of see how this works as we talk about some of the theories here probably in part 2 and part 3 of this lesson. Physical scientists use experiments in which they present hypotheses about causal relationships. They ultimately work to produce theories and natural laws. So for example, water freezing at 30, we know that water freezes at 32 degrees. That's not a theory, that's actually a natural law. But physical scientists use experimental design, but guess what? So do social sciences. So do mass communication scholars and sociologists, right? Psychologists. And the experimental design is used in many different fields. And speaking of social scientists, and we've talked about this a little bit, they are scientists who examine relationships among phenomena in the human or social world. So they're just like physical scientists, except remove the physical part. They're measuring and observing society. They're dealing with concepts, right? It's not as easy to touch and feel and grapple with what they're talking about, like in sociology or in mass communication or in anthropology, right? It's very different from, chemistry, where they're working with physical chemical properties. People are often more skeptical of social scientists, partly because they'll say, well, it's very difficult to measure human behavior. They'll say human behavior is very complicated, and other reasons. I would argue that it's very possible to do very credible and very convincing work in the social sciences. And we have not hundreds, but thousands of studies. We have entire fields that are based on very meticulously designed studies that have made accurate observations about the social world, about human behavior, about human thought, about attitudes, about perceptions and beliefs, right? We know a great deal about the social world thanks to the work of social scientists. So that's sort of an introduction. We're going to transition into looking at some theoretical foundations, some philosophical foundations, and then we'll talk about some theories. But we'll do that in part 2, and then we'll probably have to have a part 3 of this lesson as well, because it's a long lesson. You can see down there, we're only on slide 6 of 57. Ooh.